You're standing in the scorching Middle Eastern sun, weighed down by 70 pounds of metal armor. Your lips are cracked and bleeding. Your tongue feels like leather in your mouth. You haven't had water in over 24 hours. And all around you, thousands of arrows darken the sky like locusts. This isn't some nightmare. This was reality for 15,000 men on July 4th, 1187, and the decisions that led them to this hell. Those were made days before a single sword was ever drawn. What you're about to hear is the story of how an entire kingdom collapsed, not because of weakness on the battlefield, but because of catastrophic choices made in a tent. This is the story of Hattin. The summer of 1187 was different. You could feel it in the air across the Holy Land. Something was coming, something massive. Then two powers were circling each other like wolves, and everyone knew that when they finally clashed, the entire region would be reshaped. On one side stood Saladin, not just a general, not just a sultan. This man was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, ruler of Egypt and Syria, and he'd spent years preparing for this exact moment. He'd assembled something terrifying, an army between 20 and 30,000 strong. Cavalry dominated his force, light horsemen who could strike and vanish like ghosts, heavy cavalry that could shatter formations, and backing them up, disciplined infantry units hardened by years of desert warfare. But Saladin's real weapons weren't his soldiers. They were his advantages, mobility, speed, mounted archers who could unleash hell while riding at full gallop, and perhaps most crucially, his men knew how to survive in this heat. They'd been born into it, shaped by it. And there was something else. Saladin controlled everything that mattered. He decided when to fight, where to fight. He controlled the supplies, the timing. The terrain itself bent to his will because he understood something fundamental about warfare that his enemies were about to learn the hard way. Sometimes you don't need to destroy your enemy in combat. You just need to put them in a position where they destroy themselves. Across from him stood the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Their army was commanded, at least officially, by King Guy of Lusignan. Around him gathered the powerful lords and military leaders of the kingdom. Reynald of Chatillon, a man whose recklessness would cost him everything. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few voices of reason. And Gerard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, whose pride would prove as deadly as any enemy blade. The Crusader force numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men, and within those ranks marched their ultimate weapon, 12 to 1,300 heavy cavalry knights. These weren't just soldiers, they were the elite, the shock troops, armored fortresses on horseback that could break almost any enemy line when used correctly. When these knights charged, the ground itself seemed to tremble. At this point in early July, the Crusaders held every advantage. They were camped at a place called Sephoria. Water was abundant. The position could be defended easily. If Saladin wanted them, he'd have to come to them. He'd have to attack uphill, against prepared defenses, against an army that wasn't dying of thirst. The geography favored the Crusaders completely. All they had to do was wait. Just wait. But warfare isn't fought in a vacuum. It's fought by men. Men with egos. Men with concepts of honor that sometimes matter more than survival. Men who can be manipulated. Now, this is where everything started to go wrong. Word reached the Crusader camp that Saladin was threatening the city of Tiberias. Pressure began mounting on King Guy. Reynald of Chatillon and Gerard de Riedfort argued passionately that sitting at Sephoria made them look weak, cowardly. They demanded immediate action, an advance toward Saladin, a confrontation, anything but this passive waiting. On the other side of the debate stood Raymond of Tripoli. He saw through Saladin's move immediately. This was bait, obvious bait. He warned the council clearly. If they marched east from Sephoria, they'd be marching away from water, away from supply, into terrain that Saladin controlled absolutely. He pointed out the obvious. Stay at Sephoria and Saladin has two choices: withdraw or attack us where we're strongest. Either way, we win. The logic was airtight, but logic doesn't always triumph over pride. King Guy made his choice. On July 3rd, 1187, he gave the order. The army would march toward Tiberias. They would confront Saladin. They would show strength. They would walk straight into the trap. As the Crusader army broke camp that morning, the scale of the error wasn't immediately apparent. Armies on the march always look impressive. Banners flying, armor gleaming, thousands of men moving with purpose. But this march was different from the start. The summer heat was already brutal. The column moved slowly, weighed down by infantry on foot, knights in heavy armor, supply wagons, camp followers. The formation stretched out long and thin, vulnerable, and the water they were leaving behind, they wouldn't see it again. Almost immediately, the harassment began. Saladin's forces didn't engage directly. Why would they? Instead, they shadowed the Crusader column like predators following wounded prey. Muslim cavalry would ride close, unleash volleys of arrows, then wheel away before the Crusaders could respond. Then, they'd return, again and again. A constant buzzing pressure that never let up. But the arrows weren't the real weapon. The real weapon was control. Saladin's troops seized every well along the route, every spring, every water source. They blocked access to the Sea of Galilee. Every time the Crusaders tried to reach water, they found the path blocked by enemy forces. And under that merciless July sun, with every hour that passed, thirst transformed from discomfort to agony to desperation. The pace became ragged. Infantry began to lag. Formations loosened. Discipline, that critical ingredient that separates an army from a mob, started to crack. The horses suffered too. Dehydration weakened them, and weak horses meant the heavy cavalry, the Crusaders' greatest strength, was being neutralized without a single charge. By nightfall on July the 3rd, disaster had already struck. The army hadn't reached water. They were forced to halt near a pair of hills called the Horns of Hattin. The men were exhausted, parched, and completely surrounded. What had begun that morning as a march to relieve a city had become something else entirely. A death march. And they were exactly where Saladin wanted them. Isolated, desperate, trapped. As darkness fell, Saladin didn't let them rest. Muslim forces lit fires in the dry grass surrounding the Crusader camp. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. The heat became unbearable. Men coughed and gasped. The psychological torture was deliberate, calculated. While the Crusaders suffered through the night, Saladin's troops tightened the noose. Inside the Crusader lines, the situation deteriorated by the hour. Men searched desperately for any source of water. Some dug into the ground with bare hands. Others licked dew from their armor at dawn. Horses collapsed. Morale didn't just drop, it shattered. Prayers replaced strategy. Fear replaced discipline. Saladin's forces kept up the pressure all night. Arrows flew from the darkness. Skirmishes erupted and faded. No one in the Crusader camp slept. How could they? They were surrounded by enemies, tormented by thirst, and beginning to understand that they might not survive to see another sunset. By the time dawn broke on July 4th, the Crusader army had changed. They'd survived the night, yes, but they were no longer the force that had marched from Sephoria. They were broken men, clinging to hope that was already gone. King Guy tried to organize a breakout. The plan was to push toward the hills, break through Saladin's lines, and reach water. It was a reasonable idea. Under different circumstances, it might have worked. But these weren't different circumstances. The army tried to form up, tried to advance, and immediately the plan fell apart. The infantry were too weak. They stumbled forward, but couldn't maintain formation. The knights attempted to charge, but their horses were so dehydrated they couldn't generate momentum. What should have been a thunderous cavalry assault became a slow, staggered advance that Muslim archers cut apart with ease. As the Crusader formation moved, it fragmented. Units lost contact with each other. Gaps opened in the line, and Saladin's forces, watching with disciplined patience, exploited every weakness. They isolated groups, surrounded them, cut them off before they could regroup. The Crusaders tried again and again. Each attempt to break out was met with walls of arrows and rapid counterattacks. Each failure drained what little strength remained. By late morning, the army wasn't even an army anymore. It was scattered pockets of men fighting isolated battles, unable to coordinate, unable to influence the outcome. The line had broken. The battle was lost. What remained was just the dying. In desperation, some of the elite units launched final suicidal charges. Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller. These were among the finest warriors in the Christian world. They formed up one last time and rode toward Saladin's lines, knowing they were likely riding to their deaths, but refusing to surrender without a fight. They were cut down. Exhausted horses couldn't sustain a charge. The knights advanced in small, fragmented groups instead of one unified hammer blow. Saladin's mounted archers showered them with arrows from distance. Heavier units closed in when the knights were disorganized and slaughtered them methodically. Then came the moment that broke whatever spirit remained. The true cross, the sacred relic carried into battle as a symbol of divine protection, was captured. When the soldiers saw their holy standard in enemy hands, the last thread of hope snapped. Infantry threw down their weapons. Some tried to flee and were hunted down. Others simply collapsed where they stood. By midday, it was over. King Guy and most of the surviving nobles were prisoners. The Crusader army, the primary defensive force of the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem, had been annihilated. Hattin wasn't just a defeat, it was erasure. The battlefield fell silent except for the moans of the dying. Thousands of bodies lay scattered across the hills. Saladin walked among the prisoners. He ordered Reynald of Châtillon executed personally, holding him responsible for years of truce violations and provocations. Most other captives were spared according to custom and the laws of war as Saladin understood them. But the strategic implications? Those were just beginning. With no army left to oppose him, Saladin moved through the kingdom like a flood. Fortress after fortress fell, cities surrendered. Within 3 months, his forces stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. On October 2nd, 1187, the Holy City surrendered. Unlike the bloodbath when Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, Saladin negotiated terms. The population was largely spared. Ransoms were arranged for those who could pay. The news hit Europe like a thunderbolt. The unthinkable had happened. Jerusalem was lost, and the reason was clear to anyone who examined the campaign. Hattin had been decisive. One battle, one catastrophic series of decisions, and an entire kingdom collapsed. Strategically, what Saladin accomplished was masterful. He understood that you don't always need to meet your enemy's strength against strength. Sometimes you maneuver them into a position where their strengths become irrelevant. He turned the environment itself into a weapon. Heat, thirst, terrain, exhaustion. By the time the actual fighting began, the outcome was already determined. The defeat directly triggered the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, Frederick Barbarossa. The greatest warriors of Europe assembled to retake what had been lost. But Jerusalem? It would remain in Muslim hands. Hattin stands as one of history's perfect examples of how wars are won before the fighting starts, how logistics matter more than courage, how controlling resources, timing, and terrain can decide everything, and how a single bad decision, made under pressure in a command tent, can echo across centuries. 15,000 men marched from Sephoria. Most never returned. Not because they were cowards, not because they were weak, but because their leaders chose pride over strategy, chose action over patience, and walked them straight into hell. So what's the lesson here? What does a battle from over 800 years ago teach us today? Simply this: the most important decisions are often made long before the crisis hits. Strategy isn't about being the toughest or the bravest. It's about making choices that put you in a position to win. Saladin didn't defeat the Crusaders with superior numbers or better warriors. He defeated them by controlling what mattered: water, terrain, time, and by being patient enough to let his enemies make mistakes. The Crusaders had every advantage at Sephoria, and they threw it all away because they couldn't resist the bait. That's the real tragedy of Hattin. It didn't have to happen. If you found this deep dive into medieval strategy fascinating, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more historical breakdowns that go beyond the surface level, and drop a comment telling me what battle or historical event you want explored next. There are thousands of these stories buried in history, moments where everything changed because of decisions made by people under impossible pressure. And I want to bring them to you.